The two velociraptors bound across the arid landscape together. They chirp and trill to each other, their bodies and movements completely in step with each other's. They lived a perfect life. As they kicked up the dust behind them, Zano looked at his female, Oona, and each time he looked at her, realizing that she was a part of his life, that they made the perfect pair, he was overcome with joy. Oona had met Zano by a riverbank. He had just been chased by 4 male raptors out of his pack. She remembers how she saw him ducking through the tall grass, his feathery tail waving in a manner to emulate the movement of the grass. Oona remembers musing at how he was able to outsmart the other males at every turn. At that moment he had run by her, it's as if time stood still, and she could see him moving in slow motion. At that moment his eyes met hers. She could see his beautiful iridescent feathers sparkling in the dying light of the setting sun. Those eyes had so many stories to tell. After he lost the males, he came back and found Oona. He was very good at being stealthy, so that she didn't even notice he was there. But as soon as she caught his scent, she pretended as though he didn't exist, knowing that he surely would find a clever way to get her attention. Zano was funny. It was his best quality. It's why Oona loved him. There was never a dull moment with him. He always made her feel happy. Zano and Oona later had a clutch of 3 babies. They were loving parents, and each evening he would come home with new treats, new flowers, new scents that Oona could smell, waiting for the day that her eggs would hatch. When the babies had hatched one by one, Zano had left for quite a while for a few days. He never imagined himself being a father. He was free and always loved to do things his way. It's part of the reason that he was kicked out of his pack, mating with all the females that he knew were not his to mate with. He never considered himself an alpha personality, but he loved doing things his way, and if he didn't feel like listening or following, he didn't. At a whim, he would leave and be a loner for a while. Velociraptors can survive very well on their own, although it does facilitate hunting when they are hunting in a pack or in a group, and sometimes, in a community, several strange velociraptors will pair up with each other or form a group temporarily so they can overcome obstacles. Most likely, the velociraptors in the area will team up with their family members if they can get along with them. They would choose that pack and would go off on their own and spend time wherever they lived, and then meet up with their friends to hang out later. Most of the time, velociraptors would favor staying with the same pack, but Zano never stayed with one pack for very long. As the cool evening desert air drifts over his feathers, Zano looks up at the sky, marveling at the beautiful white dots that were glimmering inside of it. He wondered how deep it was, or whether or not it was an actual solid object that changed color depending on what time of the day it was. He looked back in the direction of his nest, his feathers fluffing. He had been sitting this way, his winged arms folded for a while, feeling the chilly bite of the night, wondering whether or not he should return. He was infatuated with Oona. He's met several females, but never one like her. She didn't grovel or worship the ground he walked on. She appreciated him and gave him the space to be himself. No one ever did that. All the other females wanted him to be a certain way. He couldn't understand why they fell in love with him the way he was, but then wanted him to change to fit their narrative. Zano was terrified that this would happen with Oona, but the more time he spent with her, the more he was surprised that it hadn't happened yet. Now having these 3 hatchlings, he feels as though his legs would be tied, and that he would never be able to fly away free, that he would never be himself again, that he would lose his identity in these hatchlings. As the night progressed, a cool wind flew into Zano's nostrils. He immediately opened his eyes and realized it was much later than he expected. He heard the cries of his female Oona. Oh no, she must be wondering where he is. That right there was one of the reasons he wanted to be out on his own. He didn't like someone being accountable for him and wondering where he was. He liked knowing that he could just go out and be free and not have someone worry about when he's coming back to a specific spot on the earth. It was claustrophobic for him. He got up and ran back to the nest. "Here I am," he seemed to say in annoyance as he bobbed his head up and down, making all the motions. Oona cocked her head, lovingly, wondering where he'd been. The babies are hungry, but at this point in their lives, it is very dangerous to leave them alone. Every predator here, even every prey, would seek out nice morsels of little meat to fill their palate. Everything was an opportunity here to be eaten. It would be better if Zano would go out, since he likes to travel, to get them something to eat. Zano didn't like the responsibility, and when he didn't respond right away, just staring at her, then back at the hatchlings, and then back at the sky, Oona took the initiative. She offered him to stay. He chirped and trilled loudly, fluffing his feathers momentarily, his beautiful fanned-out feathered tail bobbing up and down, as he instructed her to stay right where she was, but he would go and find something to eat. The male velociraptor ran as quickly as his legs would take him. He could feel the chill biting them at every step that he took, his tail waving wildly behind him. He loved to run. He loved to run fast and far. He could hear something in the distance. He stopped, his two legs with his dew claws skidding in the sand. He cocked his head to one side and heard a very faint noise, one that would not be picked up by most creatures. But he is a hunter. Not the greatest, but he's better than most, and he prides himself on it. He turns his head in the direction of the sound, and then starts to creep very slowly in that direction. It doesn't take long for him to find the source of the sound. A very small, bird-like creature, much smaller than him, almost like a miniature version. It flaps very loudly. Is it injured? No, it can't be. He knows better. Zano lays close to the ground, his plumage, even in the dark, blending in with the environment. The only sign of him being a living thing are his bright eyes glowing in the dark. Fortunately for him, this creature does not see. Steadily and very slowly, he cocks one of his legs out behind him. His belly is flat on the ground, his left leg folded completely underneath him, like a cat. He is flat like a log. His right leg extends fully behind him, and then crooks as he digs his claws into the sand. His dew claw, the sickle-shaped claw on the inner part of his foot, finding purchase deep within the ground and hooking there. He takes in a breath and holds it, his tail rigid and ready. He blinks once, and momentarily his two glowing eyes disappear before showing up again. And as he kicks off with his right leg, his jaws quickly open as a little bird creature leaps into the sky, taking flight with wings that are more developed than the ones that Zano seems to have at his sides. It can fly, and this always marveled Zano. But what marveled him more was his ability to jump 6 feet in the air to catch this creature. He spread out his arms to his side, and momentarily, he and the tiny bird looked identical. For that split moment, as his tail fanned out behind him, giving him the lift that he needed, and a little bit of parachuting in order to keep his balance and to slow down his fall, he was too flying. He closed his eyes in ecstasy of the feeling as his jaws quickly shut down on the squeaking creature, and as he landed softly on the ground, his legs bending to absorb the shock, causing him to spring back up momentarily, like a cat, Zano released the breath that he was holding and crunches the creature in between his jaws. He runs back and hears squeaking as Oona shifts. The little babies are hungry. He can see that there is a slight resemblance that they have to him and his female. He nervously puts the food down, and Oona is happy to have him there. She is so grateful and marvels at him. "Won't you stay?" she seems to say. His body language tells her that he doesn't want to. He sits there rigid, obviously uncomfortable. Oona shakes her head, causing her neck feathers to ruffle. Beating her tail across the sand, she seems to tell him, "I guess you can go." This night was colder than most, and she and the babies were vulnerable here. But knowing her mate, It didn't make any sense to be cross with him. She turned her head in the other direction away from him, and off he ran. Only he didn't return. As Zano ran across the lands, he felt free. He hunted and visited other packs. He found another female raptor very close by. She had just recently left her pack. She was much younger, and he paired up with her for 3 days. It's been 3 days since he's seen his female and his children. He never intended to ever see them again. He doesn't want to be committed to that. After all, what good will he do if he's always away? It doesn't make any sense he stays there. Besides, Oona was way more capable before he came along regardless. This new female was enthralled with him, and he enjoyed being with her. But after a week, he grew tired. She expected him to do all these things that Oona didn't. Oona never put those ultimatums on him, especially this early on. Even though she was upset with him the last time he saw her, she never said a word. Not in malice towards him, but this little fiery female, as beautiful as she was way too much to handle. And honestly, made Zano feel more stressed than he's ever been. He tried to leave this female, but she kept following him, until eventually he had to turn on her, and a physical fight broke out between them. Him being stronger, it was no contest. She left, only to come back later with her 5 brothers that were part of the pack that she had left. As Zano found himself running away and squawking loudly, he always wondered why he found himself in this situation. And although he enjoyed the adventure, he momentarily remembered the safe embrace of Oona, of her grooming him, of everything just being still. He remembered the first time he saw her, and how she marveled at him, not because she wanted to own him, but because she appreciated what he was, as he was. Zano feels as though he's had enough of this, and as he finally loses the males who chase him for about 2 miles, his shaking and lame legs fall down underneath him. He grooms them and grooms his tail feathers, completely covered in dust, and he makes up his mind to return to Oona and his children. It was the daytime when he had come back. Even though Zano is making his return home, he feels freer than ever, completely at ease that he is returning to his love, the one person that had embraced him for who he is. He's already made up his mind that she would be his life mate, and he wouldn't need to ever go for another pack again. If ever they needed to travel, of course they'd have to wait till the babies were older, then they could all come with him. He remembers when he had consternation about the hatchlings coming into the world, that Oona had let her know in her own way that they would just all be a pack, that it would only be a little while until they could walk for themselves, and then they would be able to follow their father. Oona had explained to him, in her way, that she never wanted to ground him, never wanted him to stay in one space. She never wanted to rob him of his spirit. She only asked that they had the honor of following him on his adventures. Of course, if he wanted their company. She never wanted to put that denial of liberty on him. There was Oona. She made a soft cooing noise as she lifted up her head and looked back towards Zano, and then she rested her head once more. He knows that she probably was upset, but didn't want to say anything. After all, he's been gone a while when she expected him to come back. He had responsibilities. Even if she said he didn't, he knew he did. Every raptor that he had known always made sure it was their duty to ensure that their offspring survived and grew to be functional. It was very crucial early in their lives, but Oona had the look of confidence and self-assurance in her eyes, as though she didn't need him. She was fine all by herself. He could hear the rustling, cracking noises of the eggshells that were still in the nest. The hot sun was beating down, but the rock that Oona had made the nest next to was casting a shadow at the hottest part of the day so that she and the babies would have shade. As Zano tentatively approached her, he wondered if she wanted something to eat. He reprimanded himself inwardly, knowing that he probably should have bought something. His feathers fluffed out momentarily in embarrassment. He cooed. No matter how mad Oona was, she would always coo back, their way of saying that they still cared for one another, but Oona did not reply, and instead, she nestled herself, laying on her babies as she looked out into the sky on the horizon. He took his gaze to where she was looking and saw nothing but a tumbleweed in the distance. He tried to nuzzle her, breaking the physical barrier between them. He'd estranged himself from her, and he worried that he was just another male to her. She still looked out into the distance, not acknowledging him, not looking at him. She was upset. He's never seen her this upset. And then again, he's never been away this long. He insisted on grooming the babies, and at first, she didn't want to move, almost as though she was punishing him, robbing him of access to them. It's not like he cared about them anyway. But after enough nudging, she finally relented and got up and shook out her feathers and walked into the sunlight to rest there. The babies still had their herky-jerky movements. They were still wobbly, still twitchy, but not as loud and annoying as they were before. They were growing, he thought to himself, and soon they would be ready. The fact that she trusts him to be so close to them means that she was sorely out of it. As he nuzzled his babies, they seemed to grate him in a lackadaisical way, as though he didn't matter to them. He nuzzled them again, and they stuck their feet out and pushed him away. He wondered why everyone was so cold towards him. Cold. So were the babies, even though the mother had just been lying on them. And then he realized that the babies weren't actually moving. It was their down, little fuzzy protrusions on their skin, their legs only flopping in the direction where he had turned them. They were all dead. Pieces of their bodies were missing. All three of his hatchlings lie there motionlessly. The only reason they had seemed as though they were moving is because little bits and pieces of them were flapping in the wind. Pieces of skin that were peeled from their tiny bodies. Pieces of them that were missing entirely. He didn't even realize that one of their heads had been completely gone. He looked back at his mate Oona, staring into space, and then it all made sense. What had happened? How could this happen? And all at once Zano blamed himself. Because Zano had been away, Oona had to bring back food to regurgitate into her babies' mouths. She was the one who had to feed them and protect them, but she couldn't be in two places at once. So as she left, she would cover them with dirt. Some of them were having trouble breathing. Her little daughter, the smallest. The babies didn't have a scent, save hers. Food was scarce, and every time she kept coming back to check the nest, she looked around to see if there was anyone there. She traveled back to that nest so many times that she was using more energy to keep coming back to her babies than to look for food. Oona was getting thinner, and she had no idea when Zano would return. It's already been a few days, and she was starving. She knew if she had nothing to eat, then her babies would also starve as they needed food. This was a crucial moment for them. And at that moment in time, as their cries got weaker and they got hungrier, she knew she had to leave them. She had to travel out further to get food. She tried 12 times, all ending in a fail, to hunt for food. The only thing that was available were these little small flying bird creatures, the ones that Zano had always been so great at catching. Oona prided herself on being able to hunt, but she couldn't hunt creatures like that. The creatures that she would hunt for only came across her line of sight once in a blue moon. She could surely go longer without food, but her babies could not. She was stressed and worried about them, and only when she traveled for many miles away from her nest did she find food to bring back to them. As she came back, she saw movement in the nest. Very weird movement. Very strange large black shadows. Her binocular vision allowed her to momentarily zoom into what she was seeing and focus from far away. And it's then she realized that those were not her babies moving around in there. Something was picking at them. They were in danger. She flapped her arms, the feathers on them bristling, and as she beat her tail into the thin, dusty, dry air, she took off at the fastest speed she has ever run, tripping momentarily and dropping the big mound of flesh that she had in her mouth, a small little creature that she had found burrowing at the last moment. It too had been starving, which is why it was caught unawares. Oona felt rage. She opened her mouth as far as it could go and screeched a loud cry. The shadowy things momentarily lifted up their dumb heads, but as they saw her, they panicked and started trying to do something to the nest. She realized they were trying to eat the babies. Why they didn't take the babies and run off with them was a mystery to her. She chased off whatever it was, these long, slinky creatures that were very small and only seemed very large because of how the heat wave distorted them from the distance. They were only twice as long as her babies and just about the same size. She had no idea what they were, but they definitely were a different species, with 4 legs, 2 little scrawny ones on the front of their bodies, and 2 on the back, a very long torso in between, and very tiny feathery-looking appendages on each side of their head. As she stomped into the nest, snapping at them and chasing them off as they went in all different directions, they went into holes in the ground that she didn't even know existed. And then she went back to her babies, checking them over. One's mouth was opening and closing in quick succession as he helplessly gasped for air that would not enter his lungs. He died shortly after. Her only surviving one was her daughter. Her neck had been broken, her head completely twisted around at a weird angle, her beautiful baby amber eyes dilating and contracting quickly, as though they could not focus any longer. One of her baby's heads was completely missing. She supposed one of the creatures had run off with it. As she stood over her nest, she walked around it, circling it, making sure nothing would ever hurt them again. Maybe she could save her babies. She didn't even want to go away from the nest to drag the meat. She had dropped it several yards away. Her babies, they depended on her. They depended on her. These were her first children. Oona did not know what to feel. A complete dismay and anger and hopelessness. She sat on them, hoping that maybe if she just kept them warm, they would make it. They would make it somehow, even though in her logical mind, a brain that is far advanced than many of the creatures of her time, she knew they were gone. But there was one thing that she had not experienced due to this traumatic event, and it was acceptance. She was in total and utter denial. It would be a while before Oona would communicate what had happened to her mate, and it would take an even longer time for Zano to earn her trust again. After the male raptor with his beautiful feathers saw how broken this free-spirited female was, he made it his mission that he wanted nothing more than to fix her and to make her happy once again, so she would look at him the way that no other female had. It took a full year for Oona to completely escape her depression. Losing her babies was a blow. They tried to mate several times, but Oona would always be aggressive towards him, not wanting him to complete. She never wanted to experience that hurt again, and she always imagined that if that had happened and they had more offspring, that Zano would just leave again. But the whole year has proven to her deep down that he had no intention of leaving. It was time for him to settle down anyway, and he couldn't pick a better female. Oona was learning to love life again. She would chatter very loudly and happily. Her tail would beat up and down as she leapt into the air, momentarily hanging there, with help from her little modified feathers. No longer did Zano have a thirst for freedom and adventure. His adventure was seeing the world again through Oona's eyes. And under the bright sun as it set in the horizon, he nuzzled against her head, and for the first time in a long while, Oona allowed him to be very close. After a sandstorm forced several raptor tribes together, a few of them in groups of 2s and 3s, Zano had the uncomfortable experience of seeing that little female he'd had fun with while he was away from his female. She was not very happy to see him, and was bold enough to go up to his female and start a fight. Oona was much larger than she was, and Oona walked away, not feeling threatened in the least. After all, if this female wants to have fun with Zano, who is she to stop him from having fun? He is his own person. She walks away, allowing the two to catch up. But this is not what the little fiery female wants. She wants a fight. Well, after all, Zano left her for this female. Even though she knew full well that Zano had been with Oona previously, it didn't matter. It was a slight against her confidence. The little female fluffed out her feathers, opened her arms to the side, and squawked loudly, calling attention to all the other raptors in the vicinity. As the sandstorm had passed, everyone shaking sand from their feathers, they needed a little bit of entertainment before they had the energy to go back to where they were. Oona did not favor this gratuitous, pugnacious behavior. It was beneath her. She snapped towards the fiery female as a warning that she did not want to fight, and as she turned her back to the little female again, the fiery female, completely beside herself at this snide behavior, leapt on top of Oona and dug her half-moon-shaped sharp claw straight into Oona's back. Oona saw red. The pain was so severe that it was all she could do, from flailing around like a fish out of water. She turned around and tried to attack the little female, but the little female's claws were dug in so deeply that she couldn't even dislodge from Oona's back if she wanted to. Finally, Oona leapt up and then onto her back, squishing the female underneath, who kicked at her wildly, wanting a fight. The little female was smaller than she was, but she was much faster and more agile. Oona couldn't even see what was happening, as this little fiery female kept on flapping towards her and biting her. All Oona could see were little clouds of feathers and body parts, not being able to make out which part was which. Oona was being bombarded by this little female. Finally, she grabbed the female by the back of the neck and threw her into the dirt. The other raptors hissed. She looked up and saw the largest group of raptors. There were 7. 5 of them being the brothers of this little fiery female. She squawked towards them and turned back her attention on Oona, and attacked her with a vitriol that Oona has never seen before. Oona shrieked loudly and bit down on the female raptor's foot, trying to pull her off of her back, but the little raptor just would not give up, and Oona was growing tired and frustrated, wanting to run, but not having the ability to even step away. This little raptor was immature. She knew nothing of dominance expression. She knew nothing of pressurized points. Most mature raptors would assert their dominance by simply putting pressure on another raptor they wanted to dominate. They would walk close to them, stare them down, doing something intimidating to cause the other raptor to have the chance to walk away. However, this little female had no idea what that was, and instead of allowing Oona to walk away, which was a submissive behavior, showing her as the more powerful and intimidating one, she refused to make the bigger female walk away. But enough was enough, and suddenly the little female was flying over, head over heels, into the dirt, and being scratched, her feathers flying everywhere. Bits of skin were being exposed, and then blood, flesh, and immediately bone. A loud thumping noise made by the feet of a raptor were sounding off. All the other raptors were hissing, some in outrage and some laughing in entertainment. It was Zano standing in front of Oona. He had attacked the little female as he had done before. Enough was enough, and let her brothers come and try. Seeing her brothers come down the hill, Oona came back and stood beside her mate. Both their tails, way above their heads and fanning out so all their feathers were splayed as far apart from each other as they could be, both of them with open mouths and their claws tapping the dirt. Enough was enough. An elderly raptor came between them and snapped in both their directions. Whoever this raptor was, the little fiery female had respect for her. She had seen enough, and in her mind it was an embarrassment that this little female would act like this in front of all the tribes. The little female, for the first time, and much to Zano and Oona's surprise, actually was submissive and behaved as though she were thoroughly embarrassed. Her beautiful tail and all the feathers attached to it lowered to the dirt as she slunk away back with her siblings. Oona and Zana went off on their own way. over the coming weeks, Zana and Oona had so much fun. All the adventures that Zana would go on, he now experienced them with Oona. And there was one thing he wanted to do for her more than anything. The most beautiful place he says he's ever found in the desert. It was going to be a long and treacherous journey, but it would be all worth their while. Oona was excited, and both of them took a while to run there. He said they didn't need to hunt for 5 days, because when they got there would be all you can eat. Oona was beside herself, irritated at this, but surprisingly, she trusted Zano. Later, when they reached their destination, Oona understood full well why Zano felt the way he did about this place. It was a canyon where many waterfalls met and poured into a beautiful pool below. There are many flying creatures, as far as the eye could see, completely covering the cliff face of this basin. Zano looked at his mate, feeling assured. She was happy. He had made her happy. And for this moment, it's as if the horrible events that happened prior had not happened at all. He quickly grabbed one from out of the air, being an expert hunter with things that could fly, and showed her the trick to doing this. She was never as good as he was. Not to mention, these things had a tendency to swarm when they were angry that you ate one of their kin. But this was the most fun Oona has ever had. They ran all the way below. It was a treacherous climb down, but Oona was with Zano every step of the way. He had been here many times, and wherever he placed his feet, she followed, using their tail feathers and their arm feathers to help to slow their descent. After reaching the bottom, they went into the water and bathed themselves. The water rolled between and over their feathers, and they groomed each other, just as they had a long time ago. When they were finally ready to leave the area, Oona was refreshed, and she thought it time to try again for another clutch. Zano, at first, having consternation about this, as is his default expression, then felt a sense of peace. He wanted this too, and this time they were both in agreement. It would be great if they get someplace a little closer to where this is, preferably someplace hidden. Maybe they could build a place. Oona liked this prospect, and she wondered, asking him as much, why there weren't other predators that were around the area. He answered her by simply saying that it was too much of a hassle. Flying creatures on the side of a cliff, it's way too treacherous, and if you slip and you fall badly, you could die. It was too much of a risk for such a seemingly small reward. But because Zano was so great at hunting, and using the opportunity that there were no other predators around, so these creatures were never expecting anything to attack them, he was able to catch many. It was also so loud with this large community of flying creatures that usually when one went missing, if he caught it the right way, nobody would notice. If they had babies nearby, they would surely be fed the best that any baby would deserve. As they found a very short dried up shrub and Oona sat under it, she wondered and asked as much, what is to stop Zano from leaving her again and abandoning the kids? He promised he wouldn't, and that all he could give now was his word, and that hopefully the past year was enough for her to have faith in that again. Everything was beautiful, and Oona realized at this moment in time how happy she was. Until she saw 3 male raptors on the horizon. This did not escape Zano's attention. He felt confident. He's outrun many raptors before. He noticed them even from far away. These were the brothers of that female. He didn't know what happened to the other 2 or what happened to the female, but these 3 were clearly out on their own, and they were the biggest ones. No worry, he seemed to tell Oona. He would be able to take care of them and outrun them. But he was used to outrunning them when there was shrubbery around. He had been out of practice, not having to deal with that kind of lifestyle. He wasn't his fittest as he used to be, and was eating more. After all, there were more successful hunts when you had a mate. He never had to run for his life or depend on stealing from others, and so he felt he was out of practice. Oona stood behind him. Her feathers bristled, and she felt like something was wrong. As the 3 males saw Oona and Zana, they immediately recognized them. and charged. Zano ran as fast as he could, and Oona right behind him. She was able to keep up, and as he swerved into the path of the males, they cut him off and caught him, something that even he didn't expect, especially with how quickly it happened. The 3 males tore at him, and Oona jumped in to try and save him. They held him in place and all snarled at Oona, telling her that they would kill him if she continued with her nonsense. She stepped away slowly, scared for her mate. This is the first time since what happened with her children that she had felt this fear for someone other than herself. She waited, wondering what would happen, knowing that they were going to get their revenge somehow. Creepily, they all looked at each other. And then, in unison, as though they'd been planning this, they all drove their sickle cell claws into her mate's head, one of the claws piercing his eye as she heard his screams cry out, one in his neck and the other in the back of his head. His whimpers quieted a decibel, but he was still alive, and then they ripped into his throat with their teeth and the rest of their claws, digging at him with their feet claws. Oona screamed in terror. She knew there was nothing she could do for her mate, and she ran in the opposite direction, kicking up the dry dirt behind her. She processed everything slowly, realizing just how barren the desert was, as the 3 males with their bloody legs, her male, Zano, the love of her life, taking his last breath only feet behind them, chased after her and quickly caught her. In only these few moments, her very happy life had turned upside down into something morbid and horrific. The 3 males had their way with her, over and over again, taking turns and sometimes assaulting her at the same time. Oona shut down mentally. She was with them. She was their toy, their prize. She expected to see the fiery female come out from somewhere as a "ha-ha, told you I'd get you back," but she was never anywhere in sight. For several weeks, the males had their way with her. It was an endless affair, and in the moments that Oona tried to fight back, they beat her soullessly. They would tear into her, scratching her eye, a scar she now bears on the left side of her face, where she is partially blind. Eventually, all Oona could do was submit to them. Until eventually, the salt in the wound was that she delivered eggs for one of the males. She waited till they went away on a hunting trip, and as she laid the eggs, she bit into them, killing each and every one of them. 6 eggs she laid for these males. When they came back and smelt the death on her face and in the nest, they forced her out of the nest, and when she refused to move so she could show them the evidence, they all piled on her, pulling viciously at her feathered wings, tearing a lot of the feathers off of her body. Oona had so many bald spots and scars all over her body that if Zano were to see her now, if he had been still alive, he would not recognize her as his female. When the 3 males saw what she had done with their offspring that she bore them, they ripped her to shreds. It took so much time for her to grow her feathers back. Poor Oona looked like a monster, and for 2 weeks, her exterior mostly matched how she felt internally, until her feathers started growing back, or at least the down on her body. Oona would lay in the nest. Every time she tried to escape, they would track her down like it was a game and find her, only to once again attack her viciously and force her back into their little cove. She was surrounded by rocks on all sides. Whenever the males came back to roost, the place was so small that they all had to lie on top of her. One of the males, the darkest feathered one, would climb on top of her and assault her while she was trying to sleep, all throughout the night. She wondered how this machine never ever took a break or slept. It seems even in his sleep he would be assaulting her, always lying on top of her, so she could not even move, and if she tried to move, to find some source of comfort, it would engage him again to continue. He made it his life mission, even to forego sleep, to make sure that she carried his eggs again, but more so because he just took pleasure in it. One day, as Oona was sitting in the rocky cove, she bristled, realizing that the males were coming back. It was the worst feeling she's ever felt. If It was total fear that enveloped her consciousness every time she knew they were coming back, as she heard their trills and chatters from a distance away. But something was different. As she looked outside of the hole, she could see that there were only 2 males. They both looked very frustrated or sad? She couldn't tell. They never showed weakness. As they made their way into the little cove, they snapped at her and took out their anger on her. Only momentarily. Oona curled up in a ball and made herself as small as possible. They stood grooming themselves and each other. Oona sneezed when the dust had kicked up into her nostrils, and this set off a chain reaction that caused both the males to bristle, look in her direction, and she became the source of all their anger and depression over losing their brother, apparently in a hunt gone wrong, when another larger predator had caught him as he was hunting with his brothers. Thankfully, after that day, the remaining males, Rig and Cag, seemed to level out. They were not nearly as aggressive as when their brother had been alive, and Oona realized that it was probably him pulling all the strings. They were still mean to her, and still assaulted her whenever they wanted to, but it was not nearly as many times as she was subject to that abuse when the other brother had been alive. Oona realized that she was going to die here. Her feathers were starting to fall out, and some of them did not grow back. She was barely getting any food, and they would not feed her. The only time she'd be allowed to hunt is when they were away hunting themselves or patrolling, and she would find little insects or little tiny creatures here and there. She had to become really good at hunting things that would fly, as those were the only things, little creatures, medium-sized creatures, that will land near the cove. She would use the cove as a sort of cover, and that way she could stay hidden and hopefully get out fast enough. Her desperation is what caused her to exercise the hunting muscle for very fast-moving creatures, and creatures that could fly, the way that her mate Zano used to. She did not often allow herself to think of him, for it was too depressing, but she also knew it would have been an insult to his life if she let these males impregnate her again, and so she had to come up with a plan. Oona started to give herself to them willingly. She would seduce them. Much to her horror, she would lift her tail and wave it around, inviting them. At first, the males were confused. Rig and Cag were not accustomed to her being so nice to them. But this was actually nicer. For a change, the female throwing themselves at their feet, they felt like kings. Well, that's more I like it, trilled Cag to himself as he mounted Oona. As she fessed up to them and built rapport, she started inviting herself on hunts, saying that she had a lot of skills that she, in fact, truthfully, did develop when Zano had been alive and she was hunting with him. He taught her so much. After all, the best hunter out of their party had been their dead brother, and lately, with everything being so scarce, they were not having a lot of luck with meals. And so Oona had an idea. She remembers the paradise. How they did not find out about it was beyond her, but it was a place that a lot of predators did not know about, and even if they did, they never thought about it being a food bank. The smorgasbord. Yes, she would lead them to that paradise that Zano had taken her to the waterfall basin, the one inside the canyons. She said on the edges of the world there was a smorgasbord to be had, with these noisy flappers, things that could fly but would just let you eat them. They were tasty and lean, but yet had the right amount of fat to keep you satiated for weeks. Rig and Cag were about to attack her, thinking she was pulling their claws, but she had sworn it, and she evoked the name of her late mate as proof. He was the one who had showed them to her and taught her how to hunt there. Feeling as though they had no energy to contest, and honestly being very desperate and hungry after not eating for weeks, they decided to let her lead them on the hunt. It was normal for her to be a part of their hunt anyway. Besides, they were starting to enjoy her company. She practiced giving herself to them at every turn, She had taught them to expect that when they were frustrated or angry, to take their aggression out on her in a pleasurable way. She found that giving herself to them in this way was better than them coming home annoyed, tired, and angry, and being aggressive and doing it in a more painful way. It's not what she wanted, but Oona had to do what she had to do to survive. At first she was terrified because she did not know if she was going to remember where the place was. But something inside of her made her recall the area, and they could hear the flappers and smell the water. How was it they never knew of this place? Rig and Cag wondered to each other. Oona smiled within herself. She had no idea what she was doing, and she's only hoping that the plan that she concocted would work. As she took them to the edge of the cliff, they looked over, feeling woozy. Oona observed their behavior, realizing that they were scared of heights. This is not something they were accustomed to. And truthfully, it wasn't something she was accustomed to either. But she had spent enough time there with Zano that she knew what to expect. She didn't want to fall either. But having stepped in his footsteps and having scaled down the cliff made her feel a sense of confidence that these males did not. This helped her plan. It made her look like she knew what she was doing. As she climbed very quietly down the cliff farther away from where the community of noisy flappers were, she told them where to go, how to position themselves. Rig and Cag were concentrating so much on not falling. There were places where they had to traverse that were extremely treacherous. Rig slipped momentarily, almost falling off the cliff to his death. He squealed in fear, and then looked up at his brother ahead of him, and then at Oona. Maybe we should go back, he wondered. Oona looked back at him, knowing the kind of personality they had. I know you guys are warriors. You wouldn't turn back. You're not afraid of anything, she goaded politely. Now, they feel like they had to prove it to this female, that they were good enough. Just like Zano had taught her, the flappers were completely unaware, and it worked out well for the raptors, because, well, their feathers allowed them to blend in with the clay-like cliffs. Oona positioned herself over the other males, climbing to a higher location. That way she could look down on the flappers. It's now or never. She was either going to be successful or die trying. It was the only thing she could do. The other males waited, and she told them to be quiet as possible. They looked up at her, and they kept their eye on the prize. She had told them that we could each grab one, and there's so many that if they fly away, we could just grab them out of the sky and eat them. And they believed her. This is what she saw Zano do. So as she stood from the cliff face at the top, looking down at the line of flappers that were below her, these flying creatures that were garrulously in conversation with each other, she struck her victim from above, leaping down at it and driving her claws deep into its skin as she fell down the harsh rocks while holding onto her prey like a snow leopard. It was a risk. She still needed food, and she needed to let the males believe what she was doing. The males immediately joined her, demanding that she give over her kill to them. Oona knew it was only a matter of time, and surely enough, as she suspected, the flappers became enraged and territorial. She directed the males to look around to see what was happening. Instead of showing the males how to steadily get out of the area, Oona snapped at the flappers, which enraged them even more. Her claw hooked into her prey as she strategically made sure that her prey fell over the cliff. As the males were engaged in defense with the flappers, who were now congregating in the area, starting to peck them quite viciously, Oona took the opportunity to quickly go after the food and scale down the cliff. She expertly slid all the way to the bottom, taking care to slide down in a way that she would not hurt herself. Over the same pathway that Zano had taken, she strategically placed herself there, knowing that it was a familiar path, and she remembered it. They've gone down there enough with the vacation that she had taken with Zano, and it had paid off. Even in his death, he had kept his promise to keep her safe. As she fell to the bottom, she was able to look up momentarily and see that the males were being swarmed. The way that they had attacked kept them in the danger zone, and because they were afraid of heights and were not taught the path to come down safely, they were stuck on the ledge and assaulted by the flyers. While on the ground near the water, Oona grabbed her prize and ran away. This had been her plan from the start, to grab the kill and take a risk to scale down the rocks, hoping that the two males would be enough of a threat to keep the flyers busy. She had dealt with these things before with Zano. She had convinced the two stupid males that these things would not attack, and now they were. The males were not good at skipping rocks, and were not going to come down there anytime soon. If anything, the flyers would get angry enough to try and pull them off of their perch, causing the males to fall and hopefully to die. Oona slipped on the very smooth rocks in the water, and she quickly stood up trying to gain her balance and ran as fast as she could, climbing up the edge of the cliff face in a different way that she had not taken before. She slipped down it, much to her dismay. She grabbed the creature and then ran out in another direction. She looked over and there was still a cacophonous uproar. She could hear the raptor screeching, one screeching very loudly. She had no idea what was happening, but all she knew is that she wanted to run, and with a stroke of luck, she hit the right step in this particular path of the cliff and was able to go up a nice little slope. It was steep enough that she dug her claws in. All the hurt from losing her babies, from being assaulted over and over again, just kept ringing through her mind. It was now or never, and if she could not escape and have her freedom, she would willingly dash herself against the rocks. But as she climbed towards the surface and out of the canyons, she ran across the desert. She ran faster than she had ever run in her entire life, even faster than when she had seen her babies being eaten from afar. She ran for Zano. She ran for them. She ran for herself, until she realized that her legs were chafing and her knees were buckling. She had been running for 2 days. Oona had found herself in a slightly different biome, one with very tall weeds and slightly wet, moist ground, water flowing deep underneath the earth. As she walked some distance away, she realized that this had been the region in which she met Zano. Several days later, she would have a clutch of 3 eggs. The eggs of her captors, no doubt, but looking as her red-colored babies hatched, knowing full well, with all certainty, that they were either the offspring of Rig or Cag. Something clicked within her, and she could not bring herself to kill them. As far as she was concerned, having been given the gift of life by Zano, who showed her that beautiful place, who showed her how to live again, who, yes, peeled her out of the deep depression she had been in, if not in blood, in spirit, these were his children.